Hi, everybody. Really happy to be with you today. If you can still see me on your screen, just want to let you know that my background that you're seeing there is actually a photo that I took in Malawi 2 years ago after Cyclone Idai, and a woman showed me this field and said, "This is what's left of my house," as their houses are made of like mud bricks that pretty much melted away during Cyclone Idai. So there's a bit of context for you. Um, so today we're gonna try to go through the different mechanisms that we use to respond to disasters in the world and how PWS&D, through its networks and alliances, is able to respond in so many different places. Although we are comparatively a pretty small organization, our reach can be pretty extensive when we see the potential with our alliances and coalitions. All right, so we're going to start by looking at last year in 2019. Where did PWS&D put its resources to respond to disasters? And you can see on this map, there are different colors. The green color is actually the place where we were doing development work, but the red color is where we responded to relief disasters, and the yellow countries are ones where we did both relief and development. So you can see here, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Malawi, Mozambique, Pakistan, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen are all places where we responded last year with relief efforts. In 2020, so far, we've responded to the Beirut explosions, as you well know, with the appeal that we sent out this summer. We also we are responding in Afghanistan with a food assistance project right now. We are responding in Syria through the Canadian Food Grains Bank and ACT Alliance. I'll talk more about that. We're responding in Yemen, mainly to food needs there that are really worsening every day. We've been responding to the Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas, although that happened last year. The funds are actually being spent this year. And we are responding in Zimbabwe as well. Further to that, we also have the COVID-19 responses, because the situation of the pandemic has created emergency situations in many countries where it's worsened, especially the food situation, because people's livelihoods have been seriously jeopardized. So we've been able to respond to the appeals in Somalia, South Sudan, Bangladesh, and Palestine, Israel. So I want to tell you a few words about our disaster response policy. So we are guided by a policy that helps us to know how to allocate our resources and what kind of process to follow when there's a disaster. Some of these principles that are in our policy are that we respond to needs, and it's on a non-preferential approach, meaning that it's irrespective of people's political allegiances or religious beliefs or ethnic backgrounds. It's really based on people's needs. So no, we don't respond only to help Presbyterians or Christians. We actually respond to those who are in need of assistance after a disaster. We also respond to high profile and low profile disasters, because some of the disasters in the world don't actually make the news very much, because the news can only cover so many things at once. So we are able to give attention to some of the lower profile disasters as well as the big ones. And we seek matching opportunities when possible through, for example, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, mostly, where we get matching funds with the government. But if we find other opportunities of getting our funds matched, we do look at that, not as an exclusive way of responding, but when we can access those, we definitely try our best. We focus on local participation and consultation. So we want to make sure that we respond to needs that are expressed by people. We're not coming and throwing things at them that they wouldn't need or wouldn't want. For example, giving out food that people are not used to eating is not very useful, because you can imagine that then it's not a very effective response. So it's important for us to listen to the local people, and having local partners on the ground really helps us for that. And that's a particularity of church-based organizations that are very well rooted on the ground. We also provide assistance way beyond the time of the disasters. So we try to help communities to get back on their feet, not just in the immediate life-saving period, but also in restoring livelihoods afterwards. And sometimes we respond to domestic disasters as well. In Canada, it's exceptionally, but when there's a national disaster, for example, when there were the Fort McMurray fires in Alberta a few years ago, that's one where we responded because we received a lot of designated donations for that. Yeah, so that's in summary. I wanted to say also that we follow international standards for humanitarian responses. PWS&D doesn't just send money out there and say, do what you can with this, and have everybody giving different types of assistance that can be ad hoc. There are international standards that are set up so that when you do food assistance, you provide food assistance that includes different components that are essential for people to be able to have a healthy diet that provides enough quantity and quality. The same goes for things like housing, for example. You can build a house that is very beautiful and expensive, but then you will only be able to provide a handful of houses with the money you have. Or you could provide houses that are just made of cardboard and will fly away at the first wind. That's you'll provide a lot of those, but they won't last for very long. So we do follow some standards that allow us to maximize the reach without compromising also the quality of what is available for people. So those are the standards that are in the core humanitarian standards and the sphere requirements, and you can look those up if you'd like on the internet to find out more details on those. So PWS&D responds essentially through two mechanisms, or three actually, two main ones. It's the ACT Alliance and the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and the third one would be we respond directly with our partners in the field. That's on a much smaller scale. Most of our responses to disasters happen through Canadian Food Grains Bank for food assistance, and through the ACT Alliance for all kinds of other interventions as well that would include health and psychosocial support, livelihood restoration, rehabilitation, education support, for example, and so on and so forth. So food is a very big component of our responses, but these other items like shelter as well are provided, and that is usually done through the ACT Alliance and our partners through them. Okay. We talked a little bit about the multiplication or accessing matching funds, and at the Canadian Food Grains Bank, we are able to get funds matched 4 to 1, up to 4 to 1 in most food assistance projects. So that really extends the reach of our funds. But it's not just through the government matching funds there. There's also a general account at the Canadian Food Grains Bank that we can access, where sometimes if it's not eligible for government funds, or if the government funds have been all used up, then we are still able to get funds matched 1-to-1 from a general account. When we do agriculture and livelihood type programming, which is not usually in the context of a disaster, but in a longer term development or in a post-disaster time, we are able to get funds matched 3-to-1 at the Canadian Food Grains Bank. So we definitely get a lot of return on our investment there at Canadian Food Grains Bank. And often what we'll do is that we will transfer funds from our account at PWS&D and transfer them to the Canadian Food Grains Bank, because we know that we will get access to all these matching funds and different programming opportunities there. I wanted to show you a short video on food assistance, how that works when we do this through Canadian Food Grains Bank. What are the different types of situations that require food assistance, and how does food assistance actually happen? What are the different modalities and those kinds of things that happen in the field? So we'll watch this short video from the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and we'll continue right after.
What would happen if you found that your plate was empty and you didn't know where your next meal was coming from? This is a situation for roughly 800 million people around the world. Why? If you live directly off the land, like many do, it might be because of a natural disaster, like flooding, or extreme drought, or because you don't have regular employment due to your social status or gender, or for other social reasons preventing you from accessing the most basic necessities of life, or perhaps conflict has forced you from your home and community. Sarah is a mother of 3 living with her elderly father. Her family was forced to flee her home community because of conflict and violence. After finding their way to a safer place, they suddenly had no regular access to food. Like millions of others, they lost all their normal supports and came to rely on outside organizations like Canadian Food Grains Bank for food. Sarah lives a world away. How can support be provided to her family? When it began, the Food Grains Bank shipped grain from Canada as a response to food crises around the world. We no longer do this. Canada in general no longer provides this type of food aid. Instead, food is now purchased as closely as possible to the area of need. This is less expensive, more efficient, and ensures the most appropriate food for those in need. It is also important for supporting local farmers and food producers. Canadian Food Grains Bank works through its 15 Canadian member agencies, who in turn work with local partners in areas where food is needed. Through these partners, who understand the local language and culture, Sarah and her family can be included in a food assistance project. She might receive a food basket, some basic staple foods and nutritional supplements. If she is able, she could participate in a Food for Work project and receive food as payment for work which further contributes to the development of her community. If she were living on farmland, she may also receive seeds or tools or even animals which provide food and income for the family. If Sarah is living in a place where there are good markets with available food, she could receive cash or food vouchers to be used with approved food vendors in local markets. This ensures people have access to food in the most practical and helpful way. Now, Sarah and her family can worry a little bit less about where their next meal is coming from and make plans to get their lives back to normal as quickly as possible. Food assistance is one important way that the Food Grains Bank, in cooperation with the Canadian government, is providing food to the people who need it most.
Great. So in order to continue on this track of talking about food assistance, let's look a little bit at this Afghanistan project that I mentioned earlier. We are just starting a food assistance project in Afghanistan because of the really deteriorating context due to COVID, but also because of climate. And as people are entering the most difficult months of the year in the winter, there's a need for the most vulnerable to get support for a few months. This project will be for 5 months and will assist 1,100 families. The budget for this project is $875,000. So that's a huge project for a small organization like us. We actually are contributing $88,000. I actually had a mistake here on this slide, but we're providing about 10% of the funds to this project, and we are leading this project with our partner in Afghanistan. This is made possible because we are getting contributions from the United Church, from World Renew, the Christian Reform Organization, from the Anglicans through the Primates Fund, from the Nazarenes, and from Tier Fund Canada. All of this through Canadian Food Grains Bank, and the Government of Canada is matching our funds 4-to-1. That means, again, that with like 10% of the funds, we are able to run a project that's almost like $900,000. And that's how a typical project happens at the Canadian Food Grains Bank. And in Afghanistan, we are leading this project, but in other places we are able to respond because we contribute our resources to others who are leading projects. For example, in the Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh, we are providing funds to World Renew, who is doing assistance there in the camps, or has done so. We can see on this slide a photo of Ken Kim. Many of you would know him as the previous director of PWS&D and also staff of the Presbyterian Church in Canada in Guatemala for about 13 years. So here he is in now working with World Renew, and was in the Rohingya camp visiting and having a photo up with a bag of the Canadian Food Grains Bank there. Moving on, I wanted to mention Cyclone Idai. That was in Africa last year, in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. I mentioned it early in the presentation with the slide backdrop that I have, the virtual background. We responded to this emergency, and we were the beneficiaries of the funds from the Humanitarian Coalition. As you can see on the slide at the top, it says Humanitarian Coalition. The Canadian Food Grains Bank is a member of the Humanitarian Coalition, and as a result, we are also then directly associated. And in the case of Cyclone Idai, we're the ones who got the matching funds from the Humanitarian Coalition. So when a Humanitarian Coalition releases an appeal in Canada and the government has matching funds for the Humanitarian Coalition, we are then part of that whole fundraising effort, and we can say that funds we raise are then matched through this effort. So Cyclone Idai was a good example of PWS&D responding through every channel that was available to us. We worked with our longtime partners in southern Malawi, for example, the Mulanje Mission Hospital, where we helped to rebuild 525 latrines that were destroyed by the cyclone. And this helped to prevent the spread of waterborne disease. As you can imagine, in big floods, it becomes a big problem. Water gets contaminated very quickly. Through the Canadian Food Grains Bank and with those matching funds that I mentioned earlier, and through the Humanitarian Coalition, we implemented a large-scale food distribution project in Malawi, which also included cash distributions to people. And in Mozambique, we provided water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities through the ACT Alliance and their appeal. Yemen is a difficult place to respond to because of its geographic location. It took us a bit of time to figure out what kind of channel to use because the ACT Alliance did not have an appeal for Yemen. Canadian Food Grains Bank didn't have any projects happening in Yemen because the partnerships were not set up that way at the time. So initially what we did is we developed a partnership with Islamic Relief Canada because they were responding in Yemen. And with a number of other denominations, we pooled some money to do a water and sanitation project in Yemen initially. Since then, we have started doing food assistance programming in Yemen through the Canadian Food Grains Bank and continue to do so for the last couple of years as the situation there is deteriorating. Looking at Syria, Syria is also a crisis that's been going on since like now 9 years. What we call those protracted crises. In that situation, as you may well be aware, millions of people left the country. 1 million Syrians ended up in Lebanon, others in Jordan, for example, and some are displaced within Syria. We are responding in all of those places through the Canadian Food Grains Bank. We have been providing food assistance in Syria with World Renew and also in Lebanon, including with the Mennonite Central Committee. And through the ACT Alliance, we've been providing other types of assistance, for example, in Lebanon and Jordan as well. For example, support for housing, education, livelihoods, trauma counseling for refugees, and so on. Of course, there's the food assistance and food baskets in a place like Lebanon is different. People will go to, might have food vouchers that they take to a supermarket that's been pre-identified, and they can buy whichever types of food that they want with the value of their vouchers. So that could include things like spaghetti or chickpeas, sugar, oil, salt, but people can choose whatever is suitable for them. So it varies on the different locations how this happens. Moving on then to the Beirut explosion. So when we think about the Beirut explosion that happened in August, this was in the context of a country that was experiencing a lot of distress to begin with. First of all, they had the million refugees from Syria that were already there, stretching the economy. They had an economy that was collapsing with its currency experiencing serious devaluation and not being worth very much, people really struggling with their livelihoods. That was before the explosions. So these explosions happened in the context as well of COVID, which had already worsened the situation for people. So the Lebanese population has been affected in multiple ways, and we have been able to so far respond through both Canadian Food Grains Bank and ACT Alliance. And we are working with, again, with World Renew and with ADRA Canada, the Adventists, to provide food assistance there. And with the ACT Alliance, we are helping to rehabilitate homes and schools, as well as providing hygiene supplies and livelihood recovery and educational kits for school-age children. One thing we have to realize in those types of emergencies is that, of course, it's big in the media right away when it happens, but a number of agencies will be right there in the news right away. You wonder how they can be so quickly on television. How do they, it's almost like they would know ahead of time that a big disaster like this was happening. But for us, being there, being the first boots on the ground is maybe not our greatest strength as a like ACT Alliance, because we take the time for our partners to assess the situation, gather, and have also not just an immediate life-saving strategy for people, but a longer-term strategy to say, well, how are we going to bring these people's livelihoods back on track? And this may take time. It may take a couple of years, but our partners are there and will be there for the long run. So we are also committed to accompany those responses in the longer term. Talking about the ACT Alliance, I'd like to just say a few words about the Rapid Response Fund that's there. The ACT Alliance has an appeal every year for the replenishing of their Rapid Response Fund. This is a central fund that is at the ACT Alliance in Geneva, and different partners all over the world can access those funds when they have emergencies, disasters that are happening in their countries. They can immediately request funds from the Rapid Response Fund, doesn't have to wait for an appeal that goes through the whole global system and all that. So quickly they can allocate funds there. So PWS&D makes a contribution to that Rapid Response Fund every year. We put $50,000 there, and that helps us to be able to respond to places like, for example, last year, drought in Indonesia, in Zimbabwe and Zambia, the migrant situation in Honduras, earthquake in Pakistan and the Philippines, flooding in India and Bangladesh. Those are just a few examples of responses that happen through the ACT Rapid Response Fund. So this is one mechanism we use. When it comes then to the COVID situation this year, ACT immediately or quite quickly set up a rapid response for the COVID situation, and members of the Alliance from various countries quickly applied for those funds so they could minimize the immediate impact of COVID in their countries. The COVID responses then happened in Somalia, South Sudan, Bangladesh, Palestine, Israel, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Syria, Yemen. In all those places, there were rapid response funds that were allocated quickly. And then, subsequently, the regional forums and the national forums in the ACT Alliance put together much more complete appeals in order to address the increasingly worsening impact of the COVID-19 in their countries, which, as you can imagine, is not only health related, but actually it's mostly livelihood related, where people are restricted in movement, and a lot of people who are day laborers, for example, can no longer find work, and they are not able to put food on their table. So there's definitely a worsening food crisis in the world as a result. And our partners through the ACT Alliance and through Canadian Food Grains Bank are monitoring this and setting up projects specifically to respond to those situations. And the Canadian Food Grains Bank has received supplementary funds from the Canadian government in order to develop specific responses that emerge as a result of the impact of COVID in many countries. And I just wanted to say that, you know, sometimes people ask, well, why work with PWS&D instead of like Red Cross or other organizations out there when it comes to disaster response or development programming for that matter? But we're talking about disaster response today. I hope that this presentation gave you enough information in that respect, and that you can feel that there are effective mechanisms of response that we have. And being a church-based agency, we have our governance systems. A number of you here today have been on our, or are on our committee, or have been on our governing committee that oversees our activities and helps to prioritize how we use our resources and develop our policies. And we are then reaching into communities where we are working with local partners who respond to local needs. So in all, and with the multiplication of our resources that we have through Canadian Food Grains Bank, I think that you can see that the Presbyterian Church in Canada has a very effective channel of response to disasters in the world.